Hi, and welcome back to this feature today here on privacy and virtual communication specific to issues in Zoom. So this is part 2 of my focus on Zoom, and in this workshop I want to specifically discuss some clear strategies that you can take to prevent the attack of Zoom bombing that has become more and more common here as many of us around the world move to more virtual forms of communication. So let's take a look right now at some features that we can implement in our Zoom settings. Okay, so again, welcome to this overview here. We'll focus primarily today on Zoom and security issues. So actually, I did a recent video where I talked about 3 topics that are really relevant to what we're talking about in terms of Zoom and Canvas. That included the type of work environment in terms of how people use their backgrounds and what their workspace looks like. Privacy issues, including not sharing student videos outside of, say, Canvas or Canvas Studio. And then most important to us today, the issue of Zoom bombing, which is the invasion of your virtual space with racist, pornographic, or inappropriate content. And so lo and behold, last night I was hosting a workshop, and there was one other LTCC faculty member on board. And it was just one of these things. I started the meeting, and all of a sudden, across the top of my virtual page, as you can see here with some of these not funny and immature names of participants, we were in for a Zoom bomb attack, and indeed it was. And there were over, I think it was close to 17 people who were took part in this meeting, attacked it, started spewing hate speech and doing crazy things. And fortunately, I stopped it quick enough. I figured it out, and I thought, okay, this is definitely not going to be a good situation. So I tried to take a screenshot, but I wanted to just end the meeting and not give these people the pleasure of what they were doing. And so I ended the meeting, and after the fact, actually, it did populate for me some of the names. Of course, these are likely fake names, as you can tell from some of these. But I ended up getting some email addresses, and I today sent that to Zoom, and hopefully, indeed, they will take some action and at least ban some of these people. But it's becoming more and more common, and I think we're aware of this in recent days. And I will share some of these articles with you on my teachingandlearning.com website. A lot of conversations have been had from the FBI and other agencies connected to Zoom, and how more and more these Zoom bombing attacks are taking place. And so what I did was, when I immediately got off the call, I realized 2 things. 1, I made some stupid mistakes that led to this hijack. And 2, I needed to do much more. I was being too open, allowing my meetings to not have any privacy settings set up ahead of time. And because of that, people were able to hijack the meeting. And as I suggested in a previous video, there are quite a few solutions, and we can go through some of these today. We'll go through them in kind of priority order. So we can talk about how to keep our meeting invites private. We can control permissions during a meeting, use the waiting room, and this will be really my number 1 recommendation for you today, and it's the one I'm using primarily as my security option. Use host abilities to control inappropriate behavior, and then use the webinar format. And so actually all of these I've suggested in that previous video. I just in some ways failed to act on these, and that's why I'm offering these tips to you today. And the other faculty member who was a part of that hijack session last evening actually said it was a good thing that it happened, because it showed how terrible and offensive these attacks can be. And it also shows just of the necessity of doing some things ahead of time to make sure that these attacks don't happen during a class or during a meeting. So we'll go through all these, and they're all, I think, very simple to implement. You'll have to decide which ones you want to use. Now, quite recently, Zoom did an update because of some of these security attacks and issues. And so I will include this also on the website. You can read it. They've talked about things they've done. And then very interesting down here, and a lot of this is offered for educators who want to set up their own virtual classrooms. And then in the future, they said they're doing some additional security options, including a feature freeze, which could be interesting. And so I'm wondering what's going to happen here, but it looks like they're definitely on top of it in terms of all these concerns. So that's really good to hear from the company that they're taking some action. So let's talk about some action we can take. So the number 1 thing I think is, from the beginning, do not publicize your meetings on social media. And so I made this mistake. Again, I'm sharing my mistakes, and I make many mistakes on technology, believe me. And I just want to offer this because hopefully in the future, you won't make these same mistakes. And so what happened was, I think I didn't, let me see here actually. So, yeah, right here, okay? So this is an example of it. So if I click on this right here, it should say, if I click on it, yep, it's going to actually launch the meeting. So as easy as that step, because there are no restrictions, all I did was click on that and then the meeting got launched. And I probably want to go back and actually see if any of these are still active meetings and if they have a record setting, because if these meetings are set up to record, even after the meeting ends, you could get people Zoom bombing and leaving inappropriate comment on videos that would get delivered to your recording cloud. It wouldn't affect anyone other than you, but it would be upsetting. So this is the number one mistake. Big X through this. Do not do this. Do not go into social media, whether Facebook or Twitter, and share meetings. Now, you probably have good intentions as I did. I wanted to share this on Twitter because I thought, hey, let's get some more folks involved. And there are some people who work at LTCC who are on my social media, primarily probably on Twitter, but also a little bit on Facebook and maybe even on YouTube. So it's very important for us to remember that anytime we share anything, if we can share it, if it's a link, it can be shared beyond our actions. So in other words, if I share this on Twitter, if I share this on Facebook, anyone could cut and paste that, and even if you have privacy settings in your social media setup, such that only your friends, for example, will get information, anyone could cut and paste this and then include that on a subsequent website. I don't know how it happened last night, but my sense was these trolls, and these are some pretty vile people. You know, you think about the morals of this. I read a story that a group of doctors currently dealing with COVID-19 were having one of these meetings, and one of these trolls came in and started this attack. And when it happens, you feel just like violated. Just all of a sudden there's chaos, there's screaming, people were shouting racial epithets. They started to take over the drawing on the screen. And because I had nothing set up, I had one option, and that was to basically hit end meeting at the top of the page, and that was it. And that's what I said. I said, we're ending this now and it's over. And then I said, okay, I'm going to try this again at 7. And so I did. I successfully did it at 7, implementing a few of the security measures that took me literally 5 to 10 minutes to implement. So that's why I want to offer this to you today. So just again, as a tip here, do not share or publicize your meetings on social media, with the exception of hardening access to the meeting. And that could be you only do a webinar, which you could share it anywhere you want because you cannot hijack a webinar. Or you could put in some of these other security settings for a typical Zoom meeting that allows for audio and video, but you have control before and prior to the meeting in terms of deciding who gets into the meeting, in terms of deciding what functions they have during the meeting. And you are able to take action right there when it happens, unlike me last night, such that you could stop things if they are inappropriate. But again, do not share links on social media unless you have plans to control that meeting. So this is the most important thing here. It's really to harden and restrict access to our meetings. 2 places this can be done. It can be done on the settings and also the meeting tab. And it's one of these things, if you know Zoom pretty well by now, you know that settings is the more global aspect of deciding what happens in your meetings going forward. Anytime you go to meetings, it's the more specific setting, less options, less global, but you can adjust things on the fly. So I can certainly set all this up ahead of time in settings, but if I want to change any of those settings, depending on what they are, I can also do that within the meeting format. So we can look at a few of these options today. Now, this one is called password, and I don't know if I'm going to be suggesting this one. So I set up last night and the 7 o'clock meeting after I got Zoom bombed at 6, and 2 people successfully participated. The waiting room was enabled. So what that means is, and I'll show you what that looks like, I let people in based on knowing those are who those people are who they say they are, and I'm not letting in some trolls. Now, the password requirement today, a faculty member wanted to get onto my 1 o'clock, and the 1 o'clock meeting had already started, and she wrote me afterwards and said, oh, I didn't have the password and I couldn't get in. So the weird thing was some people didn't need a password to get in and other people did. And so it's one of those things, again, you have to experiment with some of this. What I try to do is log on, say, with my wife's phone to the meeting I've set up, start it as a test meeting, and then try some of these things out. And that's how I was able to get some screenshots. So I cannot verify that the password is the best option. Waiting room is an incredible option. So two places to set up waiting room. One is on your global settings, and then another would also be on the meeting tab itself. And let's go ahead and take a look at that now in Zoom. So if we go to settings, and so I can either do that or I can go to the top and type in, for example, waiting for waiting room. And so this is the setting I want. And you can see if it shows modified, the default then is not a waiting room. And as you can see here, it says, and it's available with version 4.0 or later, which I think we all have. Attendees cannot join a meeting until a host admits them individually from the waiting room. If waiting room is enabled, the option for attendees to join before the meeting the host arrives is automatically disabled. So this is really key. I have this on as blue. Again, that's the non-default. It's currently active. And then I have it for all participants. I don't care who it is. I just want to control that after what I experienced last night. Now, when I then go to a meeting, if it's a meeting I've already set up, I can actually go in there and I could edit the meeting. And if it didn't have, and you'll notice if it's X'd out, it's not active. Just like in Canvas, if something is published, it's green. It's great if it's not. So as long as it's green here, I know that I've enabled the waiting room. If that's not the case, I just hit edit and I can change that. So that is the number one. That's key there. Even if people have this invite, and I'm not going to share this on social media just to be safe, they still would not be able to get past that waiting room, presumably unless they completely hack the system. So that, for me, is going to be my number one defense to have that. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. So what will happen is you'll start the meeting, and if your meeting is scheduled for, say, 2 p.m., if you start at 1:50 and people log on, you could allow them into the meeting. What will happen is once your Zoom launches and you see your control bar either at the top or bottom of the screen, it'll start to turn orange. And that is indicating that people are waiting for you. On the end of the user, this is just using my wife's phone, it'll say here, please wait, the meeting host will let you in soon. So if this was a troll right here, they'd never get into the meeting. They would just wait and wait and wait. And so as long as you know that it's the person listed here, you could hit admit and let that person in. I was thinking there's a workaround on this, and I don't want to state what that is on YouTube because, of course, trolls might use that to their advantage. So there could be reasons to have additional levels of security, and that's why we'll talk about that later in case someone did defeat this, and I could think of one way that that could happen. But if I'm fairly confident that that's the person who I think it is, I hit admit. Now, I could easily go to my roster page on Canvas if it's a class and compare the name of the person with my roster. I could do the same with my rosters on Passport. So very key if you're teaching a class to tell your students to have their login name, and they can usually choose this if they have an account, it can be set up, or they can type the name in if they're joining from a browser, which is not as full functionality as you know. But at that level then, I'll know at least the person's name. I could hit admit, or if they have some fake name that I could tell is offensive, I immediately remove and they cannot enter the meeting. So that's a really great way initially to screen. It's like different levels of defense with a castle. You know, first you would have the moat, you'd have the archers on the top, the drawbridge. So we're going through all those levels of defense, if you will, in our virtual castle, to use the metaphor. Again, the password requirement, let's continue to talk about that. I had some issues today with someone not having the password. I did send that to them, but I think were using a previous email that didn't have the password. So let's continue to check on that to see if we do want to require passwords. But that would be another level of security there. I'm a little concerned about if your personal meeting ID number gets out there on social media and someone happened to log in, a troll happened to log in at the same time, they could potentially then hijack that meeting. So that might be another reason to have a password required there as well. Registration, there's a whole slew of articles that I will include for you on using registration, what that looks like. That's another level of requiring people to pass a test for you such that they're not just going to be some last minute, spur of the moment Zoom troll who's going to try to disrupt your meeting in an offensive manner. So again, a lot of options to think about in terms of which of those you want to require. My number one will be saying use the waiting room. Now, there are some additional functionality restrictions, and these are more related to different aspects of control on the screen with different features in Zoom that could be allowed by you only as a host or could be allowed of participants. If you're ever concerned about this, you can turn a lot of these off, and thus hopefully people would not be able to disrupt your meeting. You could decide whether or not you want a virtual background. Some of the Zoom bomb attacks have used, say, pornographic backgrounds in the virtual background feature. You could decide whether or not to allow the whiteboard share to happen and annotation. I was actually on that Zoom attack last night, the Zoom bomb, and people started drawing on the screen. And the only good news last night with the 17 or so idiots who were on was that they were all trying to, be jokers at the same time, and it actually turned into total noise. It was just all this drawing on the screen and screaming and shouting. So the good news was there were enough idiots, collectively, and that's kind of a metaphor of things right now in our society, unfortunately, dealing with this pandemic, is people will be stupid and people will do things that are obviously against the better senses of, say, sensus communis and community values and ethics and civics and so forth. So you can decide whether or not to mute these features or not. And then screen sharing, because obviously if someone could screen share, they could project immediately on screen pornographic or offensive or racist images. So we want to avoid that. We certainly don't want to put our students or ourselves in situations where our safety and security is compromised, even in psychological or visual senses. So kind of decide on those. That's another level of security you could choose. Now, a third area to look at here is develop strategies for in-meeting control of participants if needed. So because of not having a waiting room and other things that weren't set up for my meeting where I was attacked last night, I couldn't do some of these options. But depending on my pre-settings, I can immediately put someone in a waiting room, which would be key if they were acting offensive, or I could remove them. So even if someone defeated the initial level of security, which was the waiting room, and even if they defeated the password, which would be another level of security, I could then, during the meeting, immediately control that person, put them in the waiting room or remove them entirely from the meeting. So it's another option there open to me. Now, here's yet another option, and you can do this in real time. So in the view here, you're looking only at the participants. At the very bottom of that view, you can see more options. And as you see here, if I wanted to, I could immediately put participants in the waiting room upon entry. I'm already doing that, so I'm not going to worry about that setting, but that's checked. This one is key. I could immediately lock the meeting. So if my meeting starts at 3 o'clock and I want to make sure that people have to be there on time, so maybe 3:05, I lock the meeting. No one else can then enter the meeting at that point. So that's another level of security, that if you got all the trolls out, if they were in there somehow and you removed them, you put them in the waiting room, or they never got in, just to be safe, you could lock the meeting at that point and have a sense of security, a feeling that it's going to be pretty safe, throughout the meeting. So that's another aspect that you could certainly take advantage of. Now, again, to do some of these options here that happen in real time, you have to make sure that some of this is set up ahead of time on your settings or was checked potentially on the meeting setting, depending on where you're working from inside of Zoom. So again, refer to either settings to do some of this, or if you're creating a new meeting, when you schedule the meeting, not as many options, but some of those, including mute participants and enable waiting room, would be options below. So just be sure to check those if those are appropriate to your security measures. Now, this one I don't recommend. This is from a recent LTCC webinar for employees, which was very good. But if you're doing a webinar, typically it's for hundreds of people, and you will not experience any level of Zoom bombing or attacks in a webinar, for the reason that even the good people, the people who need to be there, cannot even show their faces, their video, their audio is muted. And at very best, you can chat, not to all the participants, but just to the panelists typically, and you could ask some Q&A. And there's a lot of settings under a webinar format that you can take a look at if you're interested in that. And just to do that, you would actually go not to the meetings tab, but you go to the webinars tab, and then you could click there, and it looks like the webinar is not available under our current settings. So this is probably something that has to happen at a higher level at the college. So we really wouldn't then, in other words, use webinars. But if you see a webinar, you're kind of aware that they're more restrictive, and that's for practical purposes as well as security purposes. Now, another area certainly is to report offenders if applicable. And so what you can do is go to this website here, and I'll have that available for you as well if you need that contact. And then all you have to do is submit this request. It is saying right now that they're taking longer. So when I turned in my security report after the Zoom bomb attack, I put it as a normal priority. And then I included attachments of all the offender files that were involved, that I had images of. And that's a good tip, is after a meeting, if you go to your reports and then click on the it's usually a blue number here. It's your attendees. Once you click on there, you could then look at who attended. And again, if there are any email addresses, and I had a few, you could send that to Zoom, and hopefully we get these offenders banned, because they need to be banned from the use of this technology. So that's it today. I would just say to be aware and adapt. Any of the issues that we've talked about today, there are some potential solutions. As always, try to communicate how these layers of security might work with your students or participants. My number one takeaway, I think, is to really go with that format of having the waiting room, because it should protect you from the majority of trolls out there. If that continues to be an issue and you do have some that get through, then you can consider additional layers of security, such as the password, and then going in and taking advantage of reducing functionality of screen share, of virtual backgrounds, of annotation, of even audio in a meeting. Now, if you're trying to work with your students, of course, you probably don't want to do any of those, and instead harden your security up front, kind of like to use that example of the castle moat, and then in meeting take advantage of some of those controls that would allow you to put people on hold and to send them to the waiting room if there would be an issue that would arise during a meeting. So as usual, if you want more tips and advice, go to my COVID-19 resources, ltccteachingandlearning.com. Click on the tab second from the left on the top, COVID-19. Any other questions that come up, let me know. Again, we'll continue to make mistakes. I will make mistakes with the technology, with Zoom, with Canvas. As we do, hopefully, collectively, we can crowdsource some of those experiences and mistakes and turn those into advice for future users of the technology. All right, so that's it today here in this focus on using security settings in Zoom. Again, as more of us move to more virtual meetings and virtual teaching, we have to be aware of the fact that there are people out there who certainly will try to hijack some of our meetings. We can take some simple steps, as I've described today, to hopefully prevent some of those attacks. So in the future, if questions come up about anything related to Canvas or Zoom, particularly in the teaching or pedagogical context, be sure to reach out. Of course, there are numerous other people and experts on campus with the technology of Zoom and Canvas and many other aspects that might impact your work here at LTCC. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back with additional videos and workshops in the future.